Well, good afternoon, folks. It's Dr. Kremens. It's about almost 5 o'clock on Thursday here. So hope you've been having a good week. Hope the rain wasn't too bad wherever you are, and that your garden is enjoying it. I know our tomatoes are growing pretty well now, thanks to all the rain we got this week. Just got back on my bicycle. I had to run a couple errands, get some groceries, and it's nice out. It's humid, but we've been waiting for nicer weather, I guess, this summer, right? Especially with the smoke and everything the last couple of weeks. So I just wanted to give you a couple of reminders for paper number 4. First off, if you were following the other updates that I had posted yesterday, all the comments and the grades for paper or for the draft, the midterm that you turned in on Monday, those are all set. I put those in on Tuesday. So hopefully by now you've had a chance at least to take a look at some of the comments that I put in there. And just as a recap of what we talked about on Monday in class is that paper 4, remember, is now an expansion of what you started in the midterm paper. So let me go into the directions. I'm going to do a screen share here real quick, just again to give you some reminders for this. And I've got my Blackboard open, so let me just switch over here and we'll get into our class and take a little bit of a look. So just as some reminders, one of the best things you can do in terms of expanding on what you already have for this paper is use the directions as a checklist. So I'm just going to open the PDF copy here. So it's easier. So what I did a little differently on the directions than I typically do for this assignment is that I've given you basically the outline that we've discussed. It's the same outline, honestly, for this paper that we use for papers number 2 and 3, where we're focusing at the very beginning of the essay on the outside sources, which we got to start with in the midterm paper. So for this one, definitely read through this first as you start editing and expanding on what you already have for this essay. As I said in class, excuse me, you've already got, about a third of the paper there because you had that source from the database. If you had any trouble with the database source or had to add a different one, or there's something happened with that, I've also made suggestions on the sources for this. But really, this is both a writing and a revision assignment because you're already building on something you already have. And we're going to continue to kind of build on this and talk about this paper into next week as we get to the end of the class here. So as you kind of go through it, as I mentioned in some of my details here in your directions, is read through my comments. Some of the comments that I've given you will include grammatical corrections, sort of like the ones we talked about in the quiz on Monday and in some of the in the paper that we did last week in class, when we were going through some of those simple typos that often happen with English 101 papers. So that's one of the things you can correct, particularly because you're going to be using at least 2 of the paragraphs from this existing paper. And that's something else to keep in mind. What I've done for each one of you is everyone's got very individualized comments. So I've mentioned what works really well. I've mentioned what you might need to add. So just let's kind of go through this as a little bit of a reminder, particularly now that you've had these papers back for a couple of days. So first thing, for the introduction, some of you already have an introduction that'll work pretty well for this paper. Again, it varies. Everyone's essay is different, and you all had a slightly different focus. Some of you already have a good thesis. Some of you already have good introductory details. And if that was the case, I would have told you that. Anything that I would have wanted you to add to the introduction for this new version of the paper, I've given you notes on that. I've made suggestions for a new thesis, or if you had maybe too much on the author in the introduction for this and not enough about the poem that you're going to write about, I've made those notes in the margin. So that varies. Some of you, like I said, will be able to use the intro from the existing paper, the midterm essay, and some of you may need to build on that or add new material to it. So just take a look at that as you're going through. Now, in the case of the second and third paragraphs of the paper, ideally those you already have, because that came out of the midterm paper. That was the goal of going through the database research last week. So I did the same thing for those paragraphs. If I thought you needed to add transition sentences, if I thought you needed to add an additional quotation, if there was anything in it where I wanted you to include more detail or more discussion of the sources that you're using, then I mentioned that as well. And I put in some notes on those paragraphs. But as I mentioned, since you're already building this essay in the same Google Doc that you did the midterm paper in, take a look, see what's already there. And for a lot of you, you're just going to pick up basically where you left off. And that's the new sections of the paper. So you've got the 2 paragraphs, hopefully already with the database source that we used for the midterm paper for last week. And now you're adding in at least 2 new paragraphs from your new source with 2 new quotations from the additional source. Now, as I mentioned on Monday, for each one of you, I've given you a suggestion on that additional source. If you already had the source, that you needed from the database. I gave you feedback on that, and then depending on what you were writing about, depending on what the themes were and the thesis ideas were, then I've given you each one a suggestion. In some cases, I've given you a couple of options depending on what you're writing about. You don't have, and again, as I said on Monday, you don't have to use both of the sources I've given you. If you found an additional source on your own that you prefer, you also could do that. But I've given each one of you a source or a couple of sources to think about, to take a look at on your author. Because again, not only are these writers all easy to research because they're pretty prolific in terms of giving interviews and explaining their work, but I wanted to also give you some suggestions on material that I'm aware of, from other students having used it in their papers or from research I've done on my own on some of these writers, to give you a sense of what might work really well. So some of you have suggestions on, for example, interviews with Porcelino, where he talks about Buddhism and he talks about his musical influences, or I've given you in a couple of cases for Cisneros, there's a really good Chicago Public Library interview, and I've recommended that for some of you working on her. In the case of Oscar and Woods, I know for some of you it was limiting to be in those databases because those are newer authors and there's less on them in the Tribune database. There's articles on them, but it's really just a starting point. So for those two authors, I've also given you suggestions on more recent interviews with them, particularly Oscar, because their first novel came out last fall, so there was a lot of press about that. Same thing with Jamila Woods. There's a lot of good interviews with her that are online, which you kind of move outside the databases. In a couple of cases, though, there's other database articles that I may have recommended, and I've mentioned that if you need to go back in there for your second source, then you can go back into the database and find it. As always, if you have any trouble with any of those sources as you're adding it to the paper, please let me know, because the goal with the first half of this essay, with those first 4 body paragraphs, is, as I said, to provide context for a reader. If you only jump into talking about their poetry and your opinion of it, the reader's not going to have any context. They're not going to really know much about the writer. They're not going to have a good sense of who these folks are and what their goals are, what their inspirations are. So that's the goal of the first half of the paper. It's a miniature research paper, good practice for English 102 and some of your other Gen Ed classes. So again, I've given you suggestions on that. So if you do have any problem or want a different suggestion, just send me an email. I'll be happy to help you out. And you'll be including at least 2 new quotations from that new source that you've added. If you use more than 2 sources, excuse me, that's also okay. But for most of you, 2 is going to be fine for this. And then, as I said on Monday, in the second half of the paper, that's where you can really focus. You want to take 1, no more than 2 of their poems. All the poems you can use, again, are in the folder for what's now paper number 4, and just tell me what you thought of the poem. As I said on Monday, I don't need any deeper analysis of the deep meaning of the poem or some kind of secret knowledge that it contains. I want to know what you thought of it. Was it funny? Was it amusing? Was it confusing to you? So in that last 2 paragraphs of the body of the paper, you're really the focus. What did you make of it? Does their work remind you of any other poets or musicians that you enjoy? Did you find their writing easier than other poets, maybe than that you've read, which some of you mentioned you enjoy these writers better because they were more direct, not as cryptic as some poets can be. So that's really the focus in those last 2 body paragraphs, is you using first person, saying, I thought this about the poem. You can give me examples of the lines that you like, which I've done in class when, best example being the Homeroom of Doom poem by Jamila Woods, where I mentioned how much I like those lines about her classmates Birkenstocks looking like an otter gripping her feet. I think it's a funny image. And so anything like that, that's really the focus. So you're going from sharing information on what you found about the author, who they are, what their inspirations are, and then in the second half, last third or so of the paper, you're really focusing on your opinion of them. So you're providing context. This is who they are, and here's my opinion, and that's the focus of this paper. You're expressing what the science fiction writer Harlan Ellison would have called your informed opinion of this person's work based on the research that you did on them. And so that's really the last 2 body paragraphs, as I mentioned here on the directions. And in the conclusion, as we've done with all the other papers, you're summing everything up. What did you learn from your research? What did you learn by reading this poet? Do you want to read other work by them? What are your final thoughts on their writing? One of the other things I always think about with this particular assignment at the end of my 101 classes is that in the first half, you really focus on yourself more fully. Those first 3 papers we did are more narrative papers with research components to them. But in this one, you're shifting a little bit. You're looking at somebody else's work, somebody else's writing, and then kind of giving more your feedback. So there's still an element of obviously your opinion in it. It's just slightly different than what we did in those first three papers from the first part of the semester. And as I said, I've tried to give you as much suggestions as I can in terms of thesis statements, main ideas, ways to edit what you already have. So really take your time. I mean, that's the whole goal of this assignment, is to kind of give you more experience with using sources, and then not only incorporating them, but also giving your opinion along with those sources, which is good practice for the other classes you're going to be taking. And hopefully you're enjoying writing about these poets and their kind of very unique styles that each one of them works in, even though they all share that Chicago experience, which is so central to each one of them. So one last thing I want to mention before I stop the screen share and just sum things up here is for the works cited, you're using the source you already had in the previous paper. So I've given you, as I said, there's a sample work cited here. Please don't copy this, because again, if you're not writing on Jamila Woods, this is not going to be relevant. Likewise, if you are writing on Jamila Woods and you haven't used any of these sources, then that's not going to be very helpful. So here I've listed here's an example of two outside sources. This is one from an online magazine, Loud and Quiet, with a really good interview with Megan Wallace. I recommended that to a lot of you as an additional source. Here's one of the several Greg Cott articles that are in the Chicago Tribune database, which some of you ended up using for the previous paper if you were writing about Jamila Woods. And then I've also got the reference to the poem. Now, the other thing that I'll do, and I'll post this by the weekend for the last element of the works cited. You can use this model if you'd like to for the works cited for your paper. But since I provided so many of these readings for you for these poets on the announcements, for the weekend, I'll list the other ways to cite, any of the sources that you're using, because they are coming from different places. Some of these I've derived from the Poetry Foundation website. A couple of them are scans, short scans from the reading. So I'll also, as I mentioned on Monday, I'll post some of the other information you'll need for the citations at the end. Remember, you can also do that on your own if you go to the OWL website at Purdue is helpful with that. Citation Machine's really helpful. Those websites are useful. But I'll put some of that up on our Blackboard shell definitely before the weekend, so that you've got that. But this is a good model to kind of follow. And again, if you do have any questions about citation or citation format, just send me an email. Like I said, it's, I found that in most cases for any of these sources, since so many of my students are used to using Citation Machine and these other, websites that are very helpful in helping you to put together a works cited, it's not always necessary for me to give you that info, but I'm happy to do it if you need any help. And again, since we're going to do at least one more pass of drafting of this paper next week, we can fix any problems with the citations if they are there once I've had a chance to look at these papers early next week. All right, so let me stop my screen share, kind of sum everything up. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. Send me an email. Hopefully that'll help you a little bit as you expand on what you already have. So remember, you're already off to a good start. You've already got, your one source for this paper. Some of you had already started mentioning a little bit about the poems, even though that wasn't the main focus of the midterm paper. Some of you have some of that material. So just build on what you have. Let me know if you have any questions on the suggestions that I made. As always, tomorrow, in addition to some of the citation stuff, I'll post my end of the week reminder. We will do our final quiz, just focus on these writers and what we talked about in their pieces from last class. We'll do that on Monday, and I'll put some more information on that as well in the final end of the week update that I post tomorrow. So if you have any other questions, like I said, send me an email. If not, have a great rest of the day, and I'll see you in my announcements tomorrow, and then back in class again on Monday. So talk to you later. Bye.